The clock on the wall, behind the register, read 11:07 when the black Mercedes pulled into the lot. Amara Joy. Osei noticed it, the way she noticed most things during the overnight shift quietly, without making a show of it. The car was the kind that didn't belong at a place like this. Too clean, too quiet. The engine barely made a sound when it cut off, like even the machine had been trained not to draw attention to itself. The man who stepped out moved the same way. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-50s, wearing a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than Amara's rent. He walked to the pump with the kind of posture that didn't ask permission from anyone or anything. Shoulders back, eyes forward, the whole world arranged around him, rather than the other way around. He didn't look at the station, didn't look at the flickering light above pump number 3 that maintenance had been promising to fix since February. Didn't look at her through the glass when he came inside. He moved straight to the cooler. In the back, pulled out a bottle of water, set it on the counter without all a word, and tapped his card before Amara even finished the transaction. "Have a good night, sir," she said. Hal was already turning toward the door. The bell chimed. The Mercedes reversed out of the lot in one clean motion and disappeared south on the interstate, swallowed whole by the dark. Amara watched the taillights fade, then looked back down at her textbook. Third edition, bought used off the internet for $38 because the new one ran $160. The pages were marked up in 3 different colors of ink. Blue for terminology, yellow for formulas, pink for the things her professor said would definitely be on the exam. She was halfway through a chapter on patient assessment when the buzzer above the door went quiet, and the lot outside went still. It was that kind of night, the kind where the silence had weight to it. She was 27 years old and working the overnight shift at a convenience store off Interstate 109, $25 an hour, because her mother's medical bills didn't care what time it was. Celestine Osei had come to America from Ghana with 2 suitcases and a belief that hard work was its own kind of prayer. For 22 years, she cleaned hotel rooms, washed dishes, pressed other people's shirts. She never complained. Then the diagnosis came, stage 2, treatable but not cheap, and suddenly the prayer needed a copay. Amara had been studying to become a nurse since before her mother got sick. Now she was doing it faster, because the dream hadn't changed. It had just gotten more urgent. She closed the textbook at 11:45 and started her closing routine. Wiped the counter, restocked the cigarette display, checked the coffee machine. Then she walked the snack aisle, straightening bags, checking the floor for anything out of place. That's when she saw it. A wallet. Black leather, thick, sitting half hidden against the baseboard, beneath the bottom shelf, right where the chip bags ended. It must have slipped from the tall man's coat when he reached into the cooler. She picked it up. The leather was heavy and smooth, in a way that said it hadn't been bought at a department store. She opened it slowly. A driver's license. Texas. Solomon Ray Mercer. An address in River Oaks, the kind of zip code that had its own reputation in Houston. 3 cards behind it. Black. The kind most people never see in person. A folded receipt from a steakhouse in Galveston for $412. And behind that, held in a slim interior pocket, was cash. She counted it twice. $6,100. All hundreds, crisp and flat, like they'd come straight from a bank. Amara stood very still. $6,100 was 8 months of her mother's medication. It was a semester of nursing school. It was the transmission her car had needed for the past 4 months, and the security deposit on an apartment closer to the hospital where her mother had her treatments. She stayed still for a long moment. Then she reached back into the wallet, behind the cash, tucked into the innermost pocket. Like something precious, or something secret, was a photograph. Small, old, the edges soft with age. A woman, maybe 60, standing in front of what looked like a church-stained glass. Behind her, a corsage pinned to a pale blue dress, smiling the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep. Amara turned it over. On the back, in handwriting that had faded to the color of old bruises, someone had written 4 words. "Forgive me, Solomon, I was afraid." She read it twice, then a third time. Outside the parking lot, hummed with the kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like something holding its breath. The fluorescent light above pump number 3 buzzed its uneven buzz, and parked just beyond the reach of the overhead lights engine still running was a black SUV that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. Nobody got out. Amara looked at the wallet in her hand, then at the window, then back at the wallet. It was heavier than it had any right to be. $13.6 billion. And Solomon Ray Mercer ate dinner alone every single night. Not because he had to, because somewhere along the way, alone had stopped feeling like a punishment and started feeling like the only honest arrangement left. The penthouse occupied the entire 52nd floor of a tower in River Oaks, 4,000 square feet of polished concrete and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over Houston, the way a general looks out over a battlefield, with complete information and zero sentiment. The furniture was expensive and largely untouched. The kitchen was equipped by a private chef who came at 6, cooked left by 7:30, and never asked questions. The dining table set 10. Every night one place was set. Tonight, Solomon was at his desk by 9, working through a contract dispute involving a commercial property in the Woodlands. 300 pages. He'd flagged 42 issues by 10 o'clock. His reading glasses were on, his jacket was off. A cup of coffee sat beside the desk, untouched and long cold, because he'd forgotten it was there. This was the version of Solomon Mercer that the world never photographed. Not the man in the tailored suit, shaking hands at groundbreakings. Not the face on the cover of Houston Business Journal with a headline about disrupting commercial real estate. Just a 54-year-old man alone in a very large room, doing what he'd always done, working because work was the one thing that had never lied to him. His father, Marcus Sr., had worked too. Worked himself to the bone at a manufacturing plant on the east side of the city, from the time Solomon was 4 years old until the morning, in the spring of 1982, when there was an accident at the facility, and Marcus Sr. didn't come home. Solomon was 12. His mother Elaine got a phone call and a formal letter expressing condolences and an offer of compensation that barely covered the funeral. After that, Elaine Mercer cleaned houses in River Oaks, the same neighborhood where Solomon now lived on the 52nd floor. She took the bus at 5:15 every morning and came home after dark, smelling like other people's cleaning products, and she never once said a word about the unfairness of it. She saved. She prayed. She made sure her son had lunch money and a library card, and the firm understanding that the only way out was through. Solomon had taken that lesson and run with it all the way to the University of Houston on a need-based scholarship. Then, through 7 years of grinding 3 jobs at a time until he had $89,000 saved and a business plan that he believed in completely. He'd gone into that venture with a man named Gerald Thorne, the son of a prominent Houston family, well-connected, well-spoken, the kind of partner who opened doors that stayed shut for people like Solomon. They'd been friends for 2 years before they became partners. Solomon had trusted him the way you trust someone when you've watched them long enough to believe they're the real thing. Gerald Thorne, who would later build his own empire in commercial development and become Solomon's most senior business associate, emptied the partnership account on a Tuesday morning and was unreachable by Tuesday afternoon. $89,000 gone, along with every contact, every lead, every plan Solomon had spent years building. Solomon was 27 years old. He rebuilt. Of course, he rebuilt. It was the only thing he knew how to do. But something calcified in him during those months after. Something that had been opened slowly closed and locked from the inside. He stopped believing that people were essentially good and started believing they were essentially negotiable. Every relationship after that had a number attached to it, even if nobody said it out loud. The only exception was his mother. Elaine Mercer had passed 8 years ago, and Solomon visited her grave every year on the anniversary. The one photograph he kept of her, taken at Easter in 1991, her in a pale blue dress with a corsage, laughing at something, just off camera, he carried in his wallet. Not on his phone, not on a shelf. In his wallet, folded into the innermost pocket, close in the way that mattered. He reached for it, just past midnight, the way he sometimes did when the work got heavy. His hand found the wrong pocket. then the right one, then all of them. He set down the contract and stood up slowly. The coat he'd worn tonight was hung on the rack by the elevator. He checked every pocket twice. Then he walked to the kitchen counter, the foyer table, the bathroom. Nothing. He stood in the center of the penthouse and understood with the particular clarity that comes at 12:15 in the morning in a silent room that the wallet was gone, which meant the photograph was gone. He picked up his phone and called Marcus Webb, his executive assistant, who had been taking Solomon's calls at any hour for 11 years and had never once complained about it, and asked him to pull the security footage from the station off Interstate 10, where Solomon had stopped for gas earlier that evening. Marcus called back in less than 10 minutes. Sir, a pause that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. The footage from that station, the window between 10:45 and 11:30 tonight, it's been wiped. The system shows a remote access event. Someone went in and cleared it. Solomon didn't move. How long ago? He asked. The access timestamp, Marcus said carefully, is 11:32. 11:32. 25 minutes after Solomon had left the station. 25 minutes after the wallet had hit the floor. Someone had known before he did. The store was quiet, in the way that only happens after midnight, when the highway outside slows to the occasional pair of headlights and the hum of the refrigerator cases becomes the loudest thing in the room. Amara stood behind the counter with the wallet open in both hands, and the math started doing itself before she could stop it. $6,100. Her mother's medication ran $2,800 a month. The treatment plan the oncologist had outlined, the one that gave Celestine Ose the best odds. Not just the affordable odds, cost money that Amara had been moving around like furniture in a too-small apartment, shifting things from one corner to another just to make the space feel livable. 2 months of medication. That's what $6,100 meant in the most immediate pressing, keeps you up at 3 in the morning sense. But her mind kept going. Nursing school had a semester she'd had to defer because the tuition and her mother's bills had come due in the same week, and she'd made the only choice a daughter could make. That deferral was still sitting there waiting. The program didn't hold spots forever. And then there was the other thing, the dream she kept folded up in the back of her mind, the way you keep something you're not sure you deserve yet. A clinic, small, nothing fancy. A place in a neighborhood like the one she grew up in, where people who worked 2 jobs and still didn't have insurance could walk in without having to decide between a doctor's visit and groceries. She'd had the idea since she was 19 years old, sitting in the waiting room of a free clinic with her mother, watching the faces of everyone around her, tired faces, proud faces, doing the math the same way she was doing it right now. $6,100 wouldn't build a clinic, but it would be a start. Nobody would know. The camera above the register pointed at the front door, in the area behind the counter. The snack aisle, where she'd found the wallet, was a blind spot she knew, because she'd told the owner about it twice, and he'd never fixed it. The man in the expensive coat was already long gone, probably somewhere south on the interstate by now. He hadn't looked at her once, hadn't said her name, hadn't done anything that suggested he'd remember this particular stop among what were probably dozens of forgettable errands. She could close out the register, lock up, and drive home. And the only person who would ever know what had been in that wallet was standing right here. Her mother's voice came to her the way it always did, not loud, not dramatic, just present the way Celestine herself had always been present. Steady, immovable. Celestine Ose had come to America from Accra, Ghana, when Amara was 3 years old, carrying 2 suitcases, a work authorization, and a faith so deep it functioned like a second spine. She'd cleaned rooms at a hotel near the interstate for 11 years and waited tables at a family restaurant on weekends, and she had done it all without complaint and without apology and without ever once suggesting to her daughter that the world owed them anything. When the diagnosis came 2 years ago, the oncologist, using words like aggressive and manageable in the same breath, which Amara had learned meant expensive. Celestine's first response had been to reach for her daughter's hand and say, "God didn't bring us this far to leave us here, baby." She said things like that, simple things, things that shouldn't hold up under pressure, but somehow always did. And standing behind that counter, with another man's fortune in her hands, Amara heard her mother's voice as clearly as if Celestine were standing right beside her in that too-bright store. What belongs to someone else stays with someone else. That's not a rule. That's just who we are. Amara looked down at the photograph one more time. The woman in the pale blue dress, the corsage, the stained glass light, and on the back, those 4 words in faded ink, a secret someone had carried for a very long time. Whatever this photograph meant to the man who'd left it behind, it wasn't hers to decide. None of it was hers to decide. She pulled out her phone and called Troy, the morning shift guy who'd covered for her twice before and never asked for explanations, and told him she needed him in early. Then she counted the cash back into the wallet exactly as she'd found it, tucked the photograph into its pocket, and zipped her jacket. She turned off the light in the back room, set the alarm, and pushed through the front door into the April night. The parking lot felt different on the way out than it had earlier, smaller somehow. The overhead lights cast everything in that particular shade of yellow that makes shadows look deeper than they are. She was 3 steps from her car when the driver's side door of the black SUV swung open. The man who stepped out was not large, but he moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as the situation required, no more, no less. He wore a dark jacket, no tie, and an expression that had been professionally emptied of anything resembling warmth. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at her with the calm of someone who already knew how this conversation was going to go. "Miss Osei," his voice was even and unhurried, "my employer would like to make you an offer, $15,000. Cash. Tonight." Amara didn't move. The night air pressed in around her. The interstate hummed distantly. And somewhere in the back of her mind, one question rose above everything else. Not about the money, not about the man in front of her, but about something far simpler and far more unsettling. She had never told anyone her name. Nobody offers $15,000 for a wallet. That was the thought that cut through everything else, through the cold air, through the hum of the interstate, through the carefully neutral expression on the man's face, and landed somewhere in Amara's chest with the weight of something important. The man, standing 6 feet away, introduced himself without being asked, the way people do when they want to seem reasonable. "Vincent Harlow." He said it like it was a credential. "Private consultant," he added, working on behalf of a client who preferred to remain unnamed, but who was, he assured her, acting in complete good faith. I was somewhere in his mid-40s, lean in the way that suggested discipline rather than luck, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, and eyes that moved in small, efficient arcs, checking her hands, the parking lot behind her, the entrance to the store, without ever fully leaving her face. He kept his right hand relaxed at his side. His left stayed near the pocket of his jacket. Inside that pocket, though, Amara had no way of knowing, it was a device the size of a thick pen that had been recording since the moment he stepped out of the vehicle. 15,000, he said again, his tone carrying the practiced patience of someone accustomed to waiting for people to do the arithmetic. Cash. No paperwork. No questions about where you found it or what you looked at. You hand over the bag, you go home, and tomorrow morning, this is just a Tuesday, that paid unusually well. Amara looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know what you think I found," she said. "Miss Osei." The way he said her name, unhurried, like he'd been saying it for years, made the hair on her arm stand up. "My client simply wants his property returned, discreetly." "Then your client should come get it himself." Something shifted in Vincent's expression. Not anger, something more measured than that. The slight recalibration of a man who had expected a shorter conversation. "That's not possible tonight," he said. "But I want to be clear," and here his voice dropped just enough to change the temperature of the exchange, "that the contents of that wallet are considered sensitive by people who take sensitive matters seriously." It wasn't a threat. It was structured to avoid being a threat. But the space it left behind felt exactly like one. Amara zipped her jacket a little tighter, tucked the bag more firmly under her arm, and said, "I'm returning it to the owner, directly." Have a good night. She got in her car. Her hands were steadier than she expected them to be. She did not look in the rearview mirror until she'd made it to the on-ramp. Her apartment was a one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a building that had seen better decades, the kind of place where the radiator knocked in winter, and the upstairs neighbor's schedule remained a mystery. She'd made it livable the way her mother had taught her. Clean surfaces, a few plants on the windowsill, a photograph of Celestine on the bookshelf taken before the diagnosis, when her mother's smile still came without effort. Amara locked the deadbolt, slid the chain, and sat on the edge of her bed with her laptop open. She searched the name on the driver's license, Solomon Ray Mercer. What came back hit different than she'd expected. Not just wealth, the architecture of wealth. Profile pieces in business publications. A feature about his journey from the Fifth Ward to a 52-floor tower in River Oaks. $13.6 billion in holdings across Texas, Louisiana, and 3 other states. Commercial real estate, energy, infrastructure, development projects. The kind of portfolio that had its own staff just to manage the reporting. She scrolled further, and then she stopped. A headline from a business publication, dated 2 years back. Gerald Thorne, senior partner at Mercer Capital Group, denies allegations of financial misconduct. Investigation ongoing. She read the article twice. Gerald Thorne, described as Solomon Mercer's longest-standing business associate, and the man who oversaw the company's development partnerships, had been named in a complaint filed by a former contractor. The details were limited, the language was careful, but the shape of it was clear enough. Amara sat back. A man worth $13.6 billion had dropped a wallet at a gas station. The security footage from that station had been, she didn't know this yet, but she felt the outline of it, likely tampered with. A private consultant who knew her name had materialized within the hour, offering cash for a quiet exchange. And somewhere, underneath all of that, was a photograph of a woman in a pale blue dress with 4 words on the back that felt less like a caption and more like a confession. This was not about a wallet. She turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a while thinking. 2 blocks east, on the far side of the intersection, a dark sedan sat parked against the curb with its lights off. There was no marking on the outside. Inside, a woman in her late 30s, federal identification, clipped to her jacket, a thermos of cold coffee in the cup holder, watched the second-floor window of Amara's building and made a note in a small notebook. She had been watching Vincent Harlow for 6 weeks. Tonight was the first time he'd made direct contact with a civilian. She made another note. Amara, 2 blocks away, heard nothing, saw nothing. She just sat in the quiet of her apartment while the city moved around her, holding a wallet that kept getting heavier. Then at 1:30 in the morning, someone knocked on her door. 3 times. A pause. 3 more. Amara didn't move, didn't reach for the light, didn't make a sound. She sat completely still in the dark and waited to find out what kind of night this was really going to be. At 1:30 in the morning, 2 people were wide awake because of the same leather wallet, and neither one had any idea the other existed. Amara opened the door on the second knock of the second set. The woman standing in the hallway was not what she expected. Not tall, not imposing, not dressed the way people dress when they want to intimidate. She was somewhere in her late 30s, wearing a plain, dark jacket over a gray shirt with the kind of face that had learned to give very little away. She held up a credential in a leather case, a badge, and an identification card with a federal seal, and gave Amara exactly 2 seconds to read it before lowering it again. Diana Cross, she said. I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation out of the Houston field office. I'm not here to frighten you, Miss Osei. I'm here because you're involved in something that goes considerably further back than tonight, and I'd rather explain it to you before someone else does. Amara looked at the badge, looked at the woman, looked at the badge again. Then she stepped back and opened the door the rest of the way. Diana Cross, who had been running surveillance on a financial misconduct case for the past 14 months and had spent the last 6 weeks specifically tracking the movements of one. Vincent Harlow, came inside and sat at Amara's kitchen table, like someone who had learned to make herself at home in other people's difficult moments. She didn't look around the apartment, didn't comment on anything, just folded her hands on the table and started talking. The case had begun, she explained, with an anonymous tip about irregularities in a series of development contracts projects tied to a holding company called Thorne Industrial, a firm founded decades ago by a man named Harold Thorne, and now operated by his son Gerald, who also served as a senior partner in Solomon Mercer's real estate empire. The irregularities had grown over 14 months of careful work into something considerably more serious than contract fraud, the kind of serious that required documentation, the kind that required a chain of evidence that was verifiable, physical, and untampered with. The wallet, Amara said. Diana nodded once. What's inside it? A specific photograph. Amara was quiet for a moment. The woman in the blue dress. What's written on the back of it? Diana said. And what's been hidden inside the frame it came from, which Mr. Mercer keeps at his residence. That photograph is the last piece of a chain we've been building for over a year. She paused. Vincent Harlow, making contact with you tonight, tells us Gerald Thorne knows the wallet is missing, which means the window for returning it safely is closing. How did Harlow know my name? Amara asked. Your employee badge, Diana said simply. He had someone run the store's staffing records inside of 20 minutes. These are not casual people, Miss Osei. 260 miles north, in a dormitory room, at the University of Texas at Austin, a 19-year-old named Eli Mercer had not slept in 31 hours. Eli Solomon, Mercer's only son, currently enrolled in his first year. Though his focus had drifted considerably from his coursework in recent months, sat at a desk buried under printed documents with 3 different colored tabs marking pages throughout a stack that had grown steadily over the past 2 years. He was lean and sharp-featured with his father's posture, and something in his eyes that was entirely his own, a particular quality of attention that made it seem like he was always reading 2 things at once. He had started looking into Thorne Industrial, the way most young men start doing something they can't explain, a feeling, a detail that didn't sit right, a question that kept coming back, no matter how many times he tried to set it down. His grandfather, Marcus Sr., had worked at a Thorne facility. That was something Solomon had mentioned exactly once in passing when Eli was 14, and then never again. The way his father said it flat, contained like a door being closed, had stayed with Eli longer than the words themselves. 2 years of careful searching had taken him from that one closed door to a room full of open ones. The file he was looking at now was the last in a sequence he'd been assembling, piece by piece, from public records archived news sources, and one document that a former Thorne employee had shared with him after 3 months of cautious correspondence. It was a corporate safety assessment from the spring of 1982, internal, never publicly released, bearing the signature of Harold Thorne on the approval line, and on the witness line in handwriting that Eli had stared at long enough to memorize a name he recognized. Elaine R. Mercer, his grandmother, who had passed 8 years before Eli was old enough to ask her the right questions. He closed the laptop slowly. The room felt different, with the screen, dark, smaller, heavier, the way rooms get when something has shifted and there's no putting it back. He sat for a long moment absolutely still. Then he reached for his car keys. Diana drove. Amara sat in the passenger seat of a dark, unmarked sedan that smelled like stale coffee and something vaguely industrial, watching Houston move past the window at 2 in the morning, empty intersections, streetlights reflecting off wet pavement, the city doing its quiet maintenance while the rest of the world slept. They turned onto Westheimer, and the skyline rearranged itself, and then Diana slowed and nodded toward the windshield. River Oaks Tower rose 52 floors above the street, its glass face catching the ambient light of the city in a way that made it look less like a building and more like a column of captured sky. Every floor was dark, except the highest one, where a single light burned steady and unmoving behind floor-to-ceiling glass. Amara looked up at it. She did not know how she was going to get up there. She did not know what she would say when she did, and she had no way of knowing that the man behind that light, 52 floors above the street, had just set down a document he'd been staring at for an hour and walked to the window and was looking down at the city with the particular expression of someone who has realized too late that something they needed has been missing for a long time. Solomon Mercer had built $13.6 billion on the principle that information was the only currency that never depreciated. He knew what a balance sheet looked like when someone had been moving numbers around it. He knew what a contract looked like when a clause had been buried with intention rather than oversight. He knew the specific texture of a lie that had been professionally maintained, the smoothness of it, the way it held up under casual examination, but developed hairline fractures when you pressed at the edges. He pressed at the edges now. After Marcus Webb's call about the footage, Solomon had not gone to bed. He had gone to his filing system, not the digital one managed by his IT department, but the physical one, a fireproof cabinet in the back of his home office that held the documents he kept off any server connected to the outside world. 30 years of hard copies, contracts, correspondence records from the early days before everything moved to the cloud. He pulled the folder he'd assembled years ago on the Thorne family, Gerald's background, the due diligence he'd run before bringing him on as a senior partner, the material on Gerald's father, Harold, who had passed a decade ago after running Thorne Industrial for nearly 40 years. Most of it he'd reviewed before, but tonight he was looking at it differently. He found the document 40 minutes in. It was a safety compliance assessment from the spring of 1982, an internal review of operational protocols at one of Thorne Industrial's manufacturing facilities on the east side of Houston. The kind of report that regulatory bodies occasionally requested and companies occasionally buried. This one had been buried well. Solomon had obtained a partial copy years ago as part of routine background research and had filed it away without fully processing what it contained. He processed it now. The revision stamps on 3 of the pages were inconsistent with the document's stated completion date. Someone had gone back in and adjusted the language in the safety recommendations section, specifically the language regarding load-bearing equipment on the production floor. The original wording, still faintly legible beneath the correction, had recommended immediate suspension of operations pending inspection. That recommendation had been changed to monitoring with scheduled review. The signature on the approval line belonged to Harold Thorne. The incident that followed 6 weeks after that document was filed had taken the life of at least one worker at that facility. Solomon set the pages down on his desk. He did not move for a long moment. I was not a man who reached conclusions before the evidence warranted them. That discipline had served him well across 3 decades and 14 states of business. So he was careful now to hold what he knew separately from what he suspected. What he knew, the footage from tonight, had been accessed and cleared by someone who had acted within 25 minutes of his wallet hitting the floor. What he suspected, that the clearance had something to do with Gerald. What he could not yet explain, how those two things connected to a 19-year-old woman at a gas station who had his photograph and was apparently not answering his private consultant's offer. He picked up a second phone, a personal device he used for matters that didn't go through his executive office, and called Raymond Voss. Raymond was a former investigator who had done careful, discreet work for Solomon on 4 previous occasions, the kind of work that required more judgment than most people in his field possessed. He answered on the second ring, despite the hour which told Solomon he'd been expecting the call. Solomon gave him the name, Gerald Thorne, asked for everything, current activity, associations, any regulatory or law enforcement involvement in the past 2 years. Raymond called back in 11 minutes. Your partner, Raymond said, with the particular flatness of someone delivering information they know will land hard, has been under active federal scrutiny for the past 14 months. Financial misconduct, contract irregularities, and at least one related matter they haven't put in writing yet. A pause. There's something else. Solomon waited. Your son contacted the Houston field office of the federal agency handling the case approximately 3 weeks ago. They have him on record as a cooperating source. The room went very quiet. Solomon looked at his phone. The recent calls screen showed 7 missed calls from a number he recognized, Eli's cell, the one his son had gotten at the start of the school year. 7 calls across the past 4 days, distributed with the irregular urgency of someone who kept trying and kept stopping themselves. Hein had seen those calls. He had not returned them. He set the phone down on the desk next to the falsified safety report, and 30 years of careful distance, and for the first time in longer than he could honestly say, Solomon Mercer did not know what his next move was. Then his other phone rang. Unknown number. He almost let it go. Something made him answer. The voice on the other end was calm and unhurried, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering information in circumstances where the recipient needed a moment to adjust. Mr. Mercer, a brief pause. My name is Diana Cross. I'm a federal agent, and I'm currently downstairs with someone who has your wallet. Another pause, smaller than the first. I think you need to hear what she has to say. Solomon stood at the window with the phone against his ear, and the lights of Houston spread out 52 floors below him. He thought about the footage that had been wiped at 11:32. He thought about 7 missed calls. He thought about a safety report that had been altered before he was old enough to understand what it meant. Send them up, he said. Solomon Mercer had shaken hands with 2 sitting presidents, negotiated across the table from sovereign wealth fund managers who controlled more money than most countries and sat in rooms where a single signature could move the skyline of an entire city. He had never once been caught off guard by a door opening. The elevator chimed at 4:17 in the morning. The doors parted, and the woman who stepped into his foyer was so thoroughly, completely ordinary in the most specific and disarming sense of that word that Solomon stood 6 feet away and found for the first time in recent memory that he had no immediate read on the situation. She was in her late 20s, wearing a convenience store vest over a plain, dark jacket, the fabric still damp at the shoulders from rain that had stopped an hour ago. Her shoes were the kind that had been resoled at least once. Her hair was pulled back with the practical efficiency of someone who had more important things to spend her attention on. She was not nervous, or if she was, she had arranged it somewhere he couldn't see it, and she looked at him the way people rarely looked at Solomon Mercer in his own home, directly, without performance. Diana Cross, who had accompanied her up, and now stood at the edge of the foyer with the particular stillness of someone professionally committed to not being the center of the room, gave a small nod in Solomon's direction and said nothing. Amara reached into the bag she was carrying and held out a black leather wallet. You left this at the station, she said. Off Interstate 10, earlier tonight. Solomon took it from her. His hands moved through the contents, the way hands move when they already know what they're looking for, but need to confirm it anyway. The cash still exactly as he'd left it, the cards in their slots, the receipt from Galveston folded the same way. Then his fingers found the photograph. He drew it out slowly and held it in the light. His mother at Easter, 1991. The corsage, the stained glass, the smile that had belonged entirely to her and to no one else. He had carried this photograph for 33 years without once being separated from it the way you carry something, when losing it isn't a theoretical concern, but an actual one, when the thing in your pocket is the last physical proof that a person existed and loved you. He turned it over. Forgive me, Solomon, I was afraid. His thumb stayed on those words for a long moment. Something happened in the muscles of his jaw, a tightening, then a release, and his hand just briefly was not entirely steady. He had read that inscription 1,000 times. He had never fully understood it. He had told himself across all those years of carrying it that it was simply the kind of thing a woman of his mother's faith wrote on the back of a photograph. A general confession, a general fear, the private shorthand of a woman who had spent her life talking to God about things she couldn't say out loud. Standing in his foyer at 4 in the morning with the photograph in one hand and a wallet full of cash in the other, Solomon was no longer sure that was what it meant. He looked up at Amara. She was watching him with an expression that was careful, without being guarded, the look of someone who has witnessed something private and is making a deliberate choice about what to do with that information. 31 years of instinct told him to reach into the wallet, told him that what came next was a number that everyone who showed up at his door at 4 in the morning with something he needed had already calculated what it was worth to them and was waiting for him to open the negotiation. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. That was the only honest truth he had found in 3 decades of dealing with people at the highest levels of everything. He did not reach into the wallet. The impulse was there, but something about the way she was standing, without expectation, without the particular lean-forward energy of someone waiting for an offer, stopped him in a way he couldn't immediately account for. "Why did you come?" he asked instead. The question surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. It wasn't the question he'd intended to ask. It wasn't a question he typically asked anyone, because the answer was almost always reducible to something he already knew. Amara looked at him for a moment before she answered. Not because she was searching for the right thing to say, but the way you pause when the true answer is simple enough that you want to make sure the other person is ready to hear it without dressing it up. "Because it wasn't mine," she said. 4 words, no footnotes, no further explanation offered or apparently considered necessary. The penthouse was very quiet. Somewhere below, 52 floors down, the city moved through its routines, the early delivery trucks, the hospital workers changing shifts, the particular hum of a place that never fully stops. Up here, the silence had a different quality, the kind that collects in rooms where a person has been alone for a long time. Solomon looked at this woman in her damp vest and her resoled shoes, who had driven through the rain in the middle of the night to return $6,000 that wasn't hers, and he found that he had absolutely nothing to say. Not because he was moved, or not only because of that, but because in 31 years he had constructed an entire architecture of understanding around the certainty that no one did anything without a calculation behind it. And he could not find the calculation here. He had looked the way he always looked, and it wasn't there. The silence stretched between them, long and oddly comfortable, the way silence gets when both people in the room have temporarily run out of pretense. Then his phone vibrated on the desk. He glanced at the screen. Eli. Solomon looked at the phone, then at Amara, who was watching him with the same quiet attention she'd brought to everything else tonight. Then back at the phone, where his son's name sat on the screen like a question he had been avoiding for 4 days. He picked it up. The last time Solomon had heard his son's voice was 6 months ago, on a Thursday evening in October, when Eli had called to say he wasn't coming home for the holidays. Solomon had asked why. Eli had told him, and Solomon, rather than sitting with the answer, had said something measured and final, and had ended the call before either of them could say anything they couldn't take back. He had told himself afterward that it was the right move. Clean, controlled, the kind of boundary that kept things from getting complicated. Standing at the window of his penthouse at 4:17 in the morning, with his son's name on the screen, Solomon understood with a clarity that had apparently required the entire night to arrive, that what he'd told himself was not the same thing as what was true. He answered, "Dad." Eli's voice was rough at the edges, the particular roughness of someone who had been awake too long and was running on something stronger than sleep. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know," Solomon said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in 4 days. What followed was not the conversation Solomon had been bracing for across 6 months of silence. It was not an argument or an accusation, or the kind of careful negotiation that their interactions had calcified into over the years. It was something closer to a deposition, his son laying out facts in sequence, calmly, with the methodical patience of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and had decided that precision mattered more than emotion. Eli had started looking into Thorne Industrial 2 years ago. He did not explain why exactly, only that something his father had mentioned once in passing about where Solomon's own father had worked had lodged in him and refused to dislodge. He'd spent those 2 years the way young men spend time when they're determined and have nothing to lose, carefully, persistently, through public archives and records requests, and one extended correspondence with a former facility employee who had left the company in the mid-'80s and had been carrying something heavy ever since. The picture that assembled itself, piece by piece, was not the one Gerald Thorne had spent decades maintaining. Solomon listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions. He stood at the window with the phone to his ear, and Houston spread out below him and let his son talk. 'Cause somewhere in the past 4 hours, something had shifted in him quietly, without announcement, and he was no longer certain that talking was more useful than listening. Then Eli got to the last document. There was a witness signature, Eli said, on the safety assessment from the spring of '82, the one that cleared the facility to keep operating. A pause that had weight to it. It's her handwriting, Dad. I had it verified. She was there. She saw what the assessment actually said before it was changed, and someone made sure she signed the version that already had Harold Thorne's revisions in it. His voice stayed even, but the effort of keeping it that way was audible. She wasn't given a choice. That much is clear from the correspondence I found. She signed because she was afraid of what would happen to the family if she didn't. The room was very quiet. Solomon thought about his mother getting up at 5:15 every morning to take the bus to River Oaks. He thought about the way she had never spoken about the facility, not once in all the years after. He thought about how grief had a particular shape in their house. Not loud, not dramatic, but structural, the way a load-bearing wall is structural. You didn't notice it was holding things up until you thought about what would happen if it weren't there. Forgive me, Solomon. I was afraid. I had read those words 1,000 times. He had carried them for 33 years without understanding that they were not a general confession. They were a specific one. I put a note in the frame, Eli said, behind the photograph, about 8 months ago when I realized what I was looking at. I didn't know how else to. He stopped. Started again. I kept trying to call. I know, Solomon said again. Then, how far are you? A beat of silence that felt like something releasing. About 2 hours out. I've been driving since. I'll be here, Solomon said. Drive carefully. He ended the call and stood, without moving, for a long moment. Then he set the phone down, picked up the photograph from where he'd placed it on the desk, and looked at the back of it one more time. Forgive me, Solomon, I was afraid. He understood it now. All of it. The silence. The early mornings. The way his mother had cleaned other people's houses in the same neighborhood where the family that had shaped the worst morning of her life had continued to prosper. She had carried that knowledge every day and said nothing because someone had made very clear to her what saying something would cost. He forgave her before the thought was fully formed. Completely without reservation, the way you forgive someone when you finally understand that what they did came from love and not from weakness. When Eli walked off the elevator, 2 hours and 11 minutes later, he looked exactly like a young man who had driven through the night because the alternative was waiting dark circles under eyes that had his grandfather's steadiness in them. A backpack over one shoulder, a manila folder held against his chest, with the careful grip of someone transporting something irreplaceable. They stood in the foyer and looked at each other. Solomon opened his arms. Eli walked into them, without hesitation, the way he hadn't since he was young enough that the gesture didn't require courage. They didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying yet. After a moment, Eli stepped back and held out the folder. Inside was a single printed page, a scan of the witness signature line from the 1982 assessment, enlarged and annotated, with a handwriting analyst's notation in the margin. Elaine R. Mercer, confirmed match, signed under duress per contextual indicators. Solomon held the page and the photograph side by side. The handwriting on both was the same, 33 years apart and completely, unmistakably the same. He stood there for a long time. Then Eli noticed Amara. She had been sitting in a chair near the window since the call ended, close enough to be present and far enough to be respectful, with the quiet self-possession of someone who understood instinctively when a room needed space. Who is she, Dad? Eli asked. Solomon looked at his son, then at Amara, then back. She's the reason any of this happened, he said. Amara looked up from the window. She shook her head, once small and unhurried. I just returned a wallet, she said. The kitchen in Solomon Mercer's penthouse had every appliance money could justify and had been used in the past year almost exclusively by a private chef who arrived before 6 and left before the day properly started. Solomon opened 3 cabinets before he found the mugs. He stood at the counter with his back to the room, measuring out coffee grounds with the deliberate focus of a man doing something unfamiliar and unwilling to admit it, while Eli stretched out on the sofa, behind him with his eyes closed, not asleep, just arrived, the way young men arrive after driving through the night. Diana Cross had excused herself an hour ago with the professional discretion of someone who understood when a room needed fewer people in it. Amara sat at the kitchen table and watched Solomon Mercer, worth more money than she had ever seen referenced outside of a headline figure out where his own coffee filters were kept. He set a mug in front of her without ceremony, sat down across the table, wrapped both hands around his own cup, the way people do when they need something to hold. Then he looked at her and asked the question that in 31 years of boardrooms and negotiations and conversations engineered to produce specific outcomes he had almost never asked anyone, and meant it. "Tell me about yourself." Amara looked at him for a moment. Then she did. She told him about her mother, Celestine. Not the version she led with when people asked, the compressed and presentable version, but the actual one. Celestine Osei, who had left everything she knew in Accra because she believed America would give her son a different kind of life, and who had spent the next 2 decades making herself indispensable in jobs that the economy made invisible. Hotel housekeeping in the mornings, a catering company on weekends. The particular exhaustion of a woman who ran on purpose rather than rest, who measured her success not in what she accumulated, but in what she made possible for someone else. "She never talked about being tired," Amara said. "Not once. I figured out later that she was tired every single day. She just decided that wasn't information I needed." 2 years ago, during a routine appointment that neither of them had expected to be anything other than routine, the doctor had found something. The word they used was manageable. What that word meant in practice was $2,800 a month in treatment costs, no insurance, and a payment structure that Amara had been navigating. The way you navigate a river, with no map, by feel, by instinct, by not looking too far ahead. She had kept her mother's medications consistent. She had deferred a semester of nursing school. She had taken the overnight shift at the convenience store because the overnight differential was an extra $1.40 an hour, and the mornings were free for the appointments. She had not complained about any of it, because complaining about it wouldn't change the math, and because her mother had modeled across 22 years of American life a different way of dealing with hard things. She used to say that difficulty is just the shape a blessing takes before it arrives, Amara said. I used to think that was something she told herself to get through the day. Now, I think she actually believed it. Across the table, Solomon said nothing. He was not formulating a response or mapping the conversation to a desired outcome. He was just listening fully in the way that people listen when they have temporarily forgotten to protect themselves. In the United States, nearly 1 in 4 immigrants lives without health coverage, a rate more than double that of native-born citizens. For those working in service industries, the gap is wider still. The mechanisms that exist to address it are real, but inconsistently accessible, and the people most in need of navigating them are often the people with the least time and information to do so. The distance between what a person is capable of becoming and what they are actually allowed to become is not in most cases a distance of talent or effort. It is a distance of access. Amara knew this the way she knew the layout of the store where she worked, not from study, but from living it. She told him about the clinic, not as a pitch. She wasn't pitching anything, but the way you tell someone about something you've been thinking about for so long that it's become part of how you understand yourself. A small place, a real neighborhood, somewhere a family could walk in without a referral or an insurance card, or the particular shame that comes from needing help, in a system that was designed to make needing help feel like a personal failure. Nothing fancy, she said, just useful. The kind of place where someone like my mother could have walked in and had someone explain to her what her options were, without it costing her anything she couldn't afford. Solomon looked at his coffee cup for a long moment. Then he started talking. He told her about his mother taking the bus at 5:15, about the houses in River Oaks, the same houses visible from where they were sitting that Elaine Mercer had cleaned for 11 years, hands that held a mop every weekday and a hymnal every Sunday. A woman who gave everything she had to the life she was building and asked for nothing back except that it be worth something. He told her about his father, not the full weight of what he now understood, but the shape of it. The plant on the east side, the morning the phone rang, being 12 years old and watching his mother receive information that rearranged everything and watching her absorb it without falling, because falling was not something she allowed herself in front of her children. He had been talking for several minutes before he realized it. He stopped mid-sentence and looked at Amara across the table. This woman he had met 4 hours ago under the strangest possible circumstances, and registered with a particular kind of surprise that he had just said things out loud that he had not said to anyone. He stood up. "I need to show you something," he said. He walked into the home office, and she heard him open the laptop. When she followed him to the doorway, he was already turning the screen toward her, the document open on it, dense with text and official headers, and at the bottom of the page, a signature line that she recognized from everything Diana Cross had told her. The cursor rested beneath a name, Elaine R. Mercer. Some secrets are kept, not because they are safe, but because the people who know them are too afraid to speak. That was the sentence Diana Cross used to open her briefing, not the formal one she'd deliver later in a federal office with a stenographer and a recording device, but this one at a kitchen table on the 52nd floor of a building in River Oaks. As the Houston sky outside the windows moved from deep black toward the gray that comes just before dawn, she had returned an hour after leaving, this time with a leather document case that she set on the table without preamble and opened with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting a long time to do exactly this. Solomon sat across from her. Eli had pulled a chair from the living room and positioned it slightly behind his father's present, but not presuming. Amara sat to the side, still holding the mug from earlier, watching Diana, the way she watched most things in unfamiliar situations, carefully, and without performing a reaction she hadn't yet earned. Diana laid out the documents in a sequence that had clearly been arranged and rearranged many times the way you arrange something, when you know the order in which information lands matters as much as the information itself. She started in 1982, the incident at the Thorne Industrial Facility. That spring had not been an accident in any meaningful sense of the word. The safety assessment, the one Solomon had found in his own files hours earlier, the one bearing Harold Thorne's signature on the approval line, had been revised after an independent inspector flagged serious structural concerns about load-bearing equipment on the production floor. The original recommendation had called for an immediate halt to operations. What Harold Thorne signed and filed instead called for continued operation with scheduled monitoring. 6 weeks later, a section of the production floor gave way during a standard shift. Marcus Ray Mercer Sr. was among the workers present that morning. He did not come home. Harold Thorne had known the risk. He had signed a document that obscured it. And when the investigation that followed began to look at the paper trail, he had moved quickly and methodically to manage what could be found, including Diana, confirmed with the particular steadiness of someone delivering a fact they know will cause pain, securing the signature of at least one witness who had seen the original assessment before it was changed. Solomon did not look at Amara. He looked at the table. She was approached within a week of the incident, Diana said. The communication we recovered makes clear that she was told in unambiguous terms that cooperation was the condition under which her family's circumstances would remain stable. She had 2 children. She had no legal standing that would have made a challenge viable. She signed what they put in front of her. A pause. She also, we believe, spent the next 33 years trying to find a way to say so. The room held that sentence for a moment. Then Diana moved forward. Gerald Thorne had grown up knowing what his father had done. Not as a confession. Harold was not a confessional man, but as a set of facts he had been made aware of gradually as he came of age and was brought into the family's business affairs. The knowledge had not troubled him the way it might have troubled someone with a different formation. It had instead become a tool. When Gerald had identified Solomon Mercer, a young man from the 5th Ward with an exceptional instinct for real estate and no family connections, to protect him as a valuable asset, He had understood that the most efficient way to maintain proximity was to create a dependency. The partnership they'd formed in Solomon's late 20s had not been an act of friendship. It had been a calculated positioning. The $89,000 that had vanished from their joint account on a Tuesday morning had not been impulsive. It had been the execution of a plan designed to leave Solomon damaged in a specific way, distrustful, isolated, hungry enough to keep building, but wounded enough to keep needing the one person who had been placed deliberately in the role of reliable ally. 15 years. That was how long Gerald had maintained the position. Solomon sat very still. He was not a man who lost his composure publicly, and he did not lose it now. But something in the set of his shoulders changed, a barely perceptible shift, the kind that happens when a structure that has been holding weight for a very long time is asked to hold the weight of understanding why it was built that way in the first place. Eli, sitting just behind him, reached forward and put a hand briefly on his father's shoulder, said nothing, then took it away. The person he had trusted most in 15 years of business, the man who had attended dinners in this penthouse, who had shaken hands at groundbreakings, who had been present at every significant moment of the empire Solomon had constructed, had been there not because he believed in what Solomon was building, but because proximity to it served a purpose that had nothing to do with Solomon at all. Gerald had not just been complicit in what happened to Marcus Sr. He had spent 15 years making sure the son of that man would never be in a position to look too closely at why it happened. Diana's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, then looked up. "I was taken into custody approximately 40 minutes ago," she said. "At a private terminal. He had a bag packed." She let that sit for a moment, then added, and something in her voice suggested she had been looking forward to saying this part. When he asked who had compromised the operation, I told him the situation had been resolved by a convenience store employee working an overnight shift at $9 an hour. A silence followed that was different from the other silences of the night. Lighter somehow, the kind that follows when something that has been moving in the wrong direction for a very long time finally stops. Solomon exhaled slow, controlled the breath of a man who has spent decades managing what he lets the room see. Then he looked across to the chair near the window where Amara had been sitting for the past hour. Her head had tipped slightly to the side. The mug was still in her hands, held loosely. Now her grip relaxed in the way that only happens when the body has finally decided, regardless of what the mind intended, that it is done for the evening. Her expression in rest had a quality of stillness that the rest of the night had not allowed. Eli followed his father's gaze. Solomon looked at his son for a moment, then quietly enough that it would not carry across the room before Eli reached her, he said. "Wake her up gently. She needs to hear what I'm about to say." Waking up in someone else's penthouse at 5:40 in the morning, in a chair that cost more than your monthly rent, with the particular disorientation of a person who had not intended to fall asleep and is now reconstructing in real time every reason why they shouldn't have. That was a specific kind of experience that Amara had not previously had occasion to prepare for. She straightened in the chair, pushed her hair back, looked around the room. Eli was sitting on the sofa, across from her, with his elbows on his knees, watching her with the mild, non-judgmental expression of someone who had also been awake all night and had made peace with it. Diana Cross was gone sometime in the past hour. Amara gathered, based on the absence of the document case and the presence of a business card on the kitchen counter that had not been there before. Solomon was standing near the window. He had not sat down, she realized, since before she'd fallen asleep. "There's more coffee," Eli said. He made another pot. She accepted the mug Eli brought her and took a long sip and waited, because the room had the particular quality of a room where someone has decided what they want to say and is choosing the right moment to say it. Solomon turned from the window. He did not sit. He stood with his hands at his sides, in the way of a man who has spent a lifetime behind desks and podiums, and has, in this particular moment, decided that none of that furniture is appropriate. "I want to offer you something," he said. He laid it out plainly, without preamble, and without the usual architecture of a negotiation, the setup, the framing, the careful management of how the offer lands, full coverage of her nursing program, whatever institution she chose for, as long as the degree required, comprehensive medical benefits for her mother, through a plan his company maintained effective immediately upon enrollment, and a capital allocation, not a gift, he specified, but a structured investment sufficient to establish the kind of community clinic she had described. Amara set her mug down on the side table. No, she said. The word came out without hesitation and without apology, in the same tone she used when she told a customer the lottery machine was down clear, final, not unkind. Solomon looked at her. I didn't come here for this, she said. I came here because the wallet wasn't mine. That's the whole of it. I don't need anything from you. I know you don't, Solomon said. Something in his voice had changed, a quality she hadn't heard in it before, something that wasn't quite vulnerability, but lived in that neighborhood. He moved away from the window and sat down across from her, which was itself. She sensed an adjustment he was making deliberately. That's not what this is, he said. I'm not offering you something because you need it. I'm offering it because I spent 30 years building an understanding of how the world works, and every part of that understanding told me that people act from self-interest. Every part of it told me that what you did tonight was not possible. He paused. You proved that understanding wrong, at considerable personal cost, and with no audience, and for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. He looked at her steadily. I spent 30 years believing your kind of character didn't exist, he said. You proved me wrong. This is how I say so. The Houston skyline filled the windows behind him, the city catching its first pale light, the particular gray gold of a southern morning that hasn't decided yet whether it wants to be beautiful. Somewhere out there, on a street in a neighborhood she knew better than this one, her mother was asleep in an apartment that smelled like the lavender soap Celestine had used for as long as Amara could remember. She looked at Solomon Mercer, at the man who had eaten dinner alone every night in a room large enough to hold 20 people, who had built a wall around himself out of the rubble of a single betrayal and spent 3 decades maintaining it, who had just sat across from her without a desk or a contract between them and said the most honest thing she suspected he had said to anyone in a very long time. She thought about what her mother would say. Celestine Osei, who had cleaned hotel rooms for 11 years and never once suggested the world owed her a different arrangement, would not tell her daughter to refuse help that came from the right place for the right reasons. She would say something like, receiving with grace is its own kind of strength. She would say it simply, without elaboration, and she would be right. Amara looked at the window, at the city, coming slowly into its morning colors, at the space between what she had come here to do and what apparently the night had decided to become. Can I call my mother first? She asked. Solomon nodded once. She stood and moved toward the window, the city spreading wide and unhurried below the sun, not yet up, but the darkness giving way, the way darkness always eventually does. She pulled out her phone and found her mother's name in the contacts. Behind her, she heard Solomon settle back in the chair. She heard the particular silence of a man who has made an offer and released it, who is no longer managing the outcome, no longer calculating the angle, no longer doing the thing he had done in every room and every conversation for 31 years. For the first time, in longer than he could honestly account for, Solomon Mercer did not know how the next 5 minutes were going to go, and he did not reach for the shape of them. He just sat in the early morning quiet of a room that had been too large for one person for too long and waited to find out. Celestine Osei picked up on the second ring. She always did. It was one of the fixed points of Amara's life, the certainty that her mother would answer before the third ring, regardless of the hour. Not something Celestine had ever announced, just what she did, the way she did most things that mattered. Baby, warm, but careful the way you answer when the hour itself is asking for an explanation. Are you all right? I'm all right, Mama. I need to tell you something. It's going to take a few minutes. I have all the time you need, so Amara told her. She stood at the window of the 52nd floor, with Houston pale and wide below, and she told her mother everything, The wallet behind the shelf, the photograph, the 4 words on the back, the man in the black vehicle who had known her name, the federal agent at her door at 1:30 in the morning, the drive across the city, the elevator, the man who had asked, "Why did you come?" and had not seemed to be asking about money. She told her about the offer. The silence that followed was not the silence of someone processing. It was the silence of someone who has just been handed something they did not know they were allowed to put down. Then, Celestine made a sound. Amara had heard only a handful of times in her life, each time understanding instinctively that she was hearing something from a place in her mother that did not have ordinary access to the surface. Not crying in the way that word usually gets used, something older. The sound of a woman who had been carrying a specific weight for a very long time and had just been told she was allowed to set it down. Midas, Nyam, Celestine said softly. Thank you, God, in the language of the home she had left 30 years ago. The one that came back in moments too large for the language she had adopted. Then, in English, steadier, baby. I told you God sees. I know, Mama. I told you that so many times. Her voice moved between registers, now tears, and something that was almost laughter, occupying the same breath, the way they do when an emotion is large enough to hold contradictions. And every time I believed it, even when it was hard to. I know you did, Amara said. That's why I believed it too. Across the room, Solomon and Eli had drifted to the far end of the living space, not to give Amara privacy so much as because the room had developed its own quiet arrangements, each person settling into the corner the night had assigned them. They sat side by side on the long sofa, close enough that their shoulders almost touched the configuration of 2 people who had spent years at a careful distance and were discovering cautiously that the distance had always been optional. They spoke quietly. Small things. Eli mentioned the drive down from Austin the highway at 3 in the morning, the radio fading in and out, the cup of gas station coffee near Waco that had kept him going through the last 100 miles. Solomon said he used to drive that stretch in the other direction when the company was newer. He hadn't thought about that in years. They talked the way people talk when they are circling something large and are not yet ready to go at it directly, but are no longer pretending the large thing isn't there. From across the room, barely audible, Celestine's voice moved through the phone. Its particular cadence, the way it rose and fell, with the ease of someone who had learned that language was for carrying people through things, not just conveying information. Eli tilted his head slightly, listening without meaning to. She sounds like Grandma, he said quietly. He didn't look at his father when he said it. Solomon didn't answer, but something shifted in the quality of his stillness. The way a room changes when a window opens, not dramatically, just a degree of difference in the air. He looked at his son. Eli looked back. And for the first time, across all the months of distance and careful management and conversations that had been engineered to end before they got too close to anything real, there was nothing positioned between them. No posture, no prepared response. Just 2 people who shared a name and a history and a night that neither of them would ever fully explain to anyone who hadn't been in this room. Across the United States, roughly 40% of immigrant adults live without consistent health coverage, a figure that climbed sharply among those in service industries, where employer benefits are the exception. The gap accumulates across years. Deferred care, compounding conditions, the mathematics of someone who rations their own health because the copay and the electric bill cannot both be paid. The solutions exist. The access does not reach everyone equally. Celestine Osei had navigated that gap for over 2 decades on faith and refusal. The refusal to let her daughter see how hard it was. The refusal to ask for anything she hadn't earned. She was at this moment crying on the phone in a way she had not allowed herself in a very long time, and finding to her own surprise that it felt less like breaking down and more like putting something heavy in the right place at last. I love you, Mama, Amara said. I love you more. The old answer, unchanged since Amara was 4. Now go do what you need to do, baby. I'll be here. Amara ended the call. She stood at the window a moment longer. Houston fully arrived into its morning. The sun making good the city moving into the rhythms of a day that had no idea what the night had held. Then she turned. Solomon was watching her from across the room, not with the evaluating attention of the early hours, the instinct of a man who reads situations for their angles. This was different, the look of someone who has just been reminded of something they believed before they had reason not to. Your mother, he said. A pause. What's her name? By 3. In the afternoon, the table that had seated one place setting every night for years now held documents, legal pads, and 4 people who had arrived with different pieces of the same story. Diana Cross sat across from Solomon with the federal prosecutor's counsel. Beside her, a precise, measured man who had not yet uncapped his pen. Eli was at the far end. Amara had taken the chair nearest the window, slightly removed, present the way a witness is present rather than a participant. Solomon stood at the head of the table and did not sit. The ask was straightforward. The case against Gerald Thorne was substantial. 14 months of evidence, financial records, documented correspondence. What remained was testimony from someone who had been inside the operation for 15 years. Someone whose credibility and whose name carried weight in this city. We need your statement on record, Diana said. What you knew, what you observed, and what you've since learned. Tell me about my mother first, Solomon said. Diana set down her pen. What followed was the part of the file she had held back, because sequence matters, and this needed to arrive after everything else had settled. Elaine Mercer had been at the Thorne Industrial Facility the morning the revised safety assessment was filed. She had been there as a cleaning contractor, servicing the administrative offices. She had seen the original document, had understood it was different from the version later submitted. Within days of the incident that followed, a representative of Harold Thorne's legal team had approached her. The terms were explicit, recovered in a handwritten letter, found in Harold Thorne's personal papers donated to a university archive decades later, unreviewed. Elaine's silence and her signature on an amended witness statement were the conditions under which her family's housing, her son's scholarship arrangements, and her continued employment would remain undisturbed. She had been monitored at intervals for nearly a decade. She had never spoken of it, not to anyone. The 4 words on this photograph, Diana said. We believe she wrote them in the last year of her life and returned the photograph to your wallet sometime before she passed. She wanted you to find them when you were ready. The room held that sentence. Solomon reached into his jacket and took out the photograph. He had put it back that morning because putting it somewhere else had not felt right yet. He held it in both hands and looked at the woman in the pale blue dress, the corsage, the stained glass light, the smile that had belonged entirely to her. Forgive me, Solomon, I was afraid. He had read those words across 3 decades and understood them as the private shorthand of a woman of faith. He understood now that she had been speaking directly to him, that she had been afraid every day for 33 years, not of what she had done, but of what had been done to her, and of what the truth would cost the people she spent her life protecting. She had carried it until she couldn't anymore, and left the only message she knew how to leave, in the only place she knew he would eventually look. His jaw tightened, then released. She was afraid her whole life, because of them, he said, quiet and even. The least I can do is not be afraid now. He looked at Diana. I'll testify. The prosecutor's counsel uncapped his pen. Eli reached forward and placed his hand, briefly, on his father's shoulder. The same gesture, from the early hours of the morning, quiet and without requirement, then took it away. Amara gathered her jacket from the chair by the window and stood. She pulled it on with the efficiency of someone returning to the world outside this room, and reached for her bag. Miss Osei. She stopped. Solomon was still at the head of the table, the photograph in one hand, looking at her with an expression that had shed its last professional arrangement. The clinic, he said. When you're ready to find a location. A pause. I know a neighborhood. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain what he meant or why, just held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who had spent the past 12 hours learning that saying enough was different from saying everything. Amara looked at him. Something in the way he had said a neighborhood, not a property, not a location, not any of the transactional language. She might have expected, told her, the place he had in mind wasn't chosen for its market rate. She nodded once. "I'll be in touch," she said. Change doesn't happen in a single night, but sometimes a single night is enough to make a person decide that change is no longer optional. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. There was no moment of public declaration, no announcement distributed to the floors below or the business contacts above. What happened instead was quieter and in its own way more difficult, the slow, deliberate work of a man who had spent 30 years building one version of himself and was now, without fanfare, beginning to dismantle the parts that no longer fit. The first thing Solomon changed was lunch. He had eaten at his desk for 11 years, with occasional exceptions for client dinners and investor meals that were functional, scheduled, and attached to an outcome. On a Tuesday in May, 3 weeks after the night at the gas station, he rode the elevator down to the employee cafeteria on the 14th floor and carried his own tray to a table near the window. His head of operations, a woman named Patricia, who had worked for the company for 8 years and had never once eaten lunch with Solomon Mercer, looked up from her sandwich with an expression that she recovered from quickly and professionally. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She said she didn't mind. He learned that Patricia had a daughter finishing her junior year of high school and was starting to look at colleges. That the man from the infrastructure division, Marcus 2 tables over, had recently become a grandfather for the first time and had the photograph on his phone to prove it. That the woman who managed the scheduling software, whose name was Renata, and who had been with the company for 6 years, made her grandmother's tamales every December and brought enough for the whole floor. He learned their names, not as information to be filed and retrieved when useful, but the way you learn the names of people whose lives are running alongside yours and who you have until now failed to properly see. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. Every Thursday evening at 7, his phone showed an outgoing call to the same number, not scheduled through Marcus Webb, not entered into the calendar his assistant maintained in 15-minute increments. Just Solomon in whatever city the week had taken him, to stepping away from whatever table or room he was in, and calling his son because he wanted to hear how the week had gone. Eli picked up every time. They talked about the coursework Eli was rethinking. In the weeks after that night, something had shifted in how Eli understood what he wanted to do with what he was learning, a pivot still in early form, toward the area of law that dealt with corporate conduct and the structures that allowed certain kinds of harm to persist for decades without consequence. He was talking to professors, reading cases, figuring out whether the thing he cared about could become the thing he was trained for. Solomon listened to all of it. He asked questions, real ones, not the evaluative kind, designed to redirect, but the kind that came from genuine curiosity about who his son was becoming. "Corporate accountability," he said on one of those Thursday calls. "That's good work, Eli. Hard work, but good." He said it plainly, without qualification, without the instinct to immediately follow a compliment with a condition. Eli was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "Thanks, Dad," he said. Just that. Solomon sat with it. The simplicity of it. How little it had cost him to say, and how long he had gone without saying it. Gerald Thorne faced formal charges on a Thursday morning in June 14 counts, covering financial misconduct, obstruction, and related offenses, stretching back further than most of his associates had known to look. The proceedings drew coverage in the business press, the kind of coverage that arrives when someone with a long-maintained reputation is revealed in public and in detail to have been something other than what the reputation suggested. Solomon took the stand on the second day. He had been prepared by counsel for the particular texture of that experience, the formality of it, the way questions are structured to lead without appearing to lead, the importance of answering only what is asked. He had sat through the preparation with patience and had taken notes. When the moment came, he found that he did not need them. He gave his account in the same voice he used in boardrooms, measured, precise, without excess, but with something underneath it that boardrooms had not previously heard. He did not look away from the questions. He did not calibrate his answers for the least damaging interpretation. He said what he knew, in the order he had come to know it, and when the account reached the part about his father and his mother, and 33 years of a secret that had been kept by force rather than choice, his voice did not change register. He had told himself, in the days before, that he would not run his hands together under the table the way he sometimes did when a negotiation was difficult. He did not run his hands together under the table. Vincent Harlow, the private consultant who had approached Amara in the parking lot and recorded the exchange, without her knowledge, entered a guilty plea the following week and agreed to full cooperation with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced disposition. He was, as it turned out, one of several people Gerald had employed over the years to manage situations that required discretion, a fact that added several additional lines to a file that was already substantial. The case would take months to fully resolve. That was the nature of these things. But the structure that had held certain truths in place for 3 decades had developed in the space of a single night, and its long aftermath a crack too large to repair. It was a Wednesday evening in late June when his phone rang with a number he recognized. Mr. Mercer, Amara's voice, direct as always. I think I found it. I was at his desk. He set down what he was reading. Send me the address, he said. He looked at the message that came through a moment later. A street in a part of the city he knew better than any other. The part he had left at 20 and had not returned to with intention since. I'll meet you there, he said. Solomon Mercer had grown up on Lyons Avenue. Not the Lyons Avenue that appeared on city planning maps or in neighborhood revitalization proposals. The one with projected foot traffic and investment potential. In language, about community assets. The actual one. The one with the corner store that kept its good inventory behind the counter, and the church on the block that ran a food pantry out of its side entrance on Saturdays. And the particular sound of a neighborhood that had been asked to do more with less for so long that it had simply incorporated the asking into its daily rhythms. He had left at 20 and had not come back. Not because he was ashamed of it, he had told himself that across the years and had mostly believed it, but because the forward momentum of building something had made looking back feel like a luxury he couldn't afford. And then it had become a habit, and then it had become something he didn't examine too closely. I was examining it now. The building Amara had found was on a side street 2 blocks off the avenue, a narrow storefront with a glass front and a for-lease sign that had been there long enough to fade at the edges. The neighborhood around it was the kind that held its history, visibly older homes with well-kept yards sitting beside ones that needed attention, a barber shop that had been operating under the same name for decades, a laundromat with a hand-lettered hour sign taped to the inside of the window. Amara was already there when he arrived, standing on the sidewalk with a woman Solomon recognized before any introduction was offered. Celestine. Osei was shorter than her daughter, with the kind of posture that comes not from height, but from having carried things with dignity for a long time. She wore a dark green coat and sensible shoes, and looked at Solomon Mercer, at his car, at his coat, at his face, with the unhurried assessment of a woman who had spent decades reading situations quickly and had learned that first impressions were data, not verdicts. She extended her hand. Her grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who has worked with her hands and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. Mr. Mercer, she said. Her accent carried Ghana, the way certain things carry their origin, not loudly, but as a permanent and unashamed part of what they are. Mrs. Osei, he said. They looked at each other for a moment, with the particular acknowledgement of 2 people who have heard a great deal about each other from someone they both love, and are now deciding in real time how much of that information to hold openly. Then Amara stepped forward and began to walk them through the space. She had done her work. That was clear within the first 2 minutes. She knew the square footage, the utility infrastructure, the zoning classification, the terms the owner was willing to discuss. She knew which wall could be removed to expand the waiting area and which couldn't without structural consequence. She had a layout sketch in a folder, nothing architectural, just a hand-drawn plan in pencil that showed where a reception desk might go, where examination areas could be partitioned, where a small children's corner might fit in the space near the front window. She presented it the way she did most things, without decoration, without performance, just the information and the reasoning behind it. Solomon listened. He looked at the sketch. He looked at the room. He looked at the street through the glass front. I had been on this block before. Not this specific building, but this block. He knew it the way you know the geography of your childhood, not from conscious memory, but from the body, which retains certain maps long after the mind has moved on. His mother had cleaned a house 4 streets over. He remembered walking with her once on a Saturday when the usual bus route was disrupted past exactly this intersection. He would have been 9, maybe 10. She had held his hand without him asking her to, which she only did when she was tired, though she would never have said so. He did not tell Amara or Celestine that. He stood at the front window of the empty storefront and looked out at the street for a long moment, and the street looked back. The way places look when they have been waiting for something without knowing what it was. My mother cleaned houses in this neighborhood, he said. He said it to the window as much as to the room. For 11 years. She took the bus here before it was light out, and she came home after dark. He paused. My father worked at a facility across town. He went in one morning and the facility wasn't safe, and the people who knew it wasn't safe had decided that fixing it cost more than they wanted to spend. Another pause shorter. So he didn't come home. He turned from the window. It's time something good came back here, he said. Something that belongs to the people who actually live in it. That's what this is. The room was quiet. Celestine, who had been standing slightly to the side with the folder Amara had handed her, stepped forward. She did not say anything. She reached out and took Solomon's hand in both of hers. The grip of someone who has comforted people through things that words don't reach, who understands that sometimes presence is the more complete language. She held it for a moment. Then she nodded once, with the deliberate weight of someone for whom a nod means something specific and permanent. Solomon looked down at her hands around his, the hands of a woman who had cleaned hotel rooms for 11 years on a body that was now carrying a diagnosis with a monthly price tag attached, who had raised a daughter in a 1-bedroom apartment and sent her into the world with the kind of values that held up at 1:30 in the morning when nobody was watching. The hands of his mother, he thought. Not literally, but in every way that it mattered in this moment, on this street. His eyes went red at the edges. He did not look away. He did not turn toward the window or reach for composure the way he would have 6 months ago in any room with any other people. He just stood on the sidewalk of the neighborhood where he had begun, with a woman's hands holding his, and let what was happening in his face be visible. For the first time in longer than he could name, he did not manage it. "Hun, let it be there." The sign went up on a Thursday morning in March, and it was smaller than Amara had originally pictured, which was, she had decided exactly right. Mama's House, Community Clinic. Everyone welcome. White letters on a deep blue background. Mounted flush against the brick above the front door of the storefront on the side street off Lyons Avenue. Not grand, not trying to be. Just clear the way. A door should be clear, visible from the sidewalk. Readable at a distance. The kind of sign that says what it means without requiring anything from you before you walk in. The morning was cool and bright, the particular quality of a Houston March that hasn't yet committed to the heat that's coming. The sky wide and unhurried, the neighborhood moving through its early rhythms around them. The barbershop 2 doors down had its gate up. The laundromat was already running its first loads of the day. A woman walking a small dog stopped to read the sign, nodded at it like she approved of something, and kept moving. Inside, the space had been transformed from the empty shell Amara had sketched in pencil 4 months ago into something that felt against all architectural odds, like the word its name promised. A reception desk in warm wood near the entrance. Chairs along the waiting area, in a color that was neither clinical nor cheerful, but somehow both. A small table in the corner near the front window with a box of crayons and a stack of paper, because families came with children, and children needed somewhere to put their attention. It was not a large space. It was a right-sized space. They had all come. Diana Cross arrived first, which surprised no one who had spent any time around her. She was the kind of person who arrived before the stated time and used the extra minutes to assess the room. She stood near the door with a cup of coffee and said, when Amara came in carrying the last box of supply deliveries, that it looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like. Eli came in behind his father, talking about something that made Solomon shake his head in the way parents shake their heads when they are not actually disagreeing. He looked different than he had on the night all of this began. Not older, exactly, but more settled in himself, the way people look when they have found the direction they were meant to be moving in and have started moving there in earnest. Celestine arrived in a cab, which Amara had arranged without telling her, and then pretended she hadn't arranged when her mother mentioned it. She wore the same dark green coat from Fifth Ward, and had her good earrings on the gold ones she reserved for occasions that warranted them. She walked into the clinic slowly, the way she walked everywhere, now that the treatment had brought her strength back in increments, rather than all at once, and stood in the center of the waiting room and looked around with the expression of a woman taking inventory of something she had been praying toward for a long time. Baby, she said quietly. You did it. We did it, Amara said. Solomon had not told Amara he was bringing anything. He arrived with a flat package under his arm, wrapped in paper, approximately the size of a standard photograph frame. He set it on the reception desk without ceremony and let Amara open it. Inside was a frame, simple dark wood, the kind that draws no attention to itself. And behind the glass, the photograph. The woman in the pale blue dress, the Easter corsage, the stained glass light coming through behind her soft and colored, the smile that had belonged entirely to her. He had taken it out of his wallet the morning after that night, had carried it to a framing shop on a Tuesday, the kind of errand he had not thought to schedule, and so had simply done between two other things because it needed doing. She would have wanted it somewhere people are being helped, he said. That was who she was. Amara looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she picked it up, walked to the wall beside the reception desk, and hung it at eye level, next to a photograph that had been there since the day before, which Amara had mounted herself quietly, without making an event of it. Celestine Osei, in a yellow dress, standing in front of the first hotel where she had worked, smiling the smile of a woman who has just arrived somewhere and believes completely that she is going to be all right. Two women, two countries, two lives assembled from the materials of difficulty and love and the refusal to let either one be the whole story. Solomon stood and looked at the two photographs side by side. In the United States, community health clinics that specifically serve immigrant populations have been shown to reduce emergency room utilization in surrounding areas by as much as 30% in their first 3 years of operation. The families they reach are disproportionately those who have until that point made decisions about their own health based on what they could afford rather than what they needed. The difference a single accessible clinic makes to a single neighborhood is not always visible in the aggregate data. It is visible in the waiting room, in the faces of the people who come in carrying something they have been carrying too long and leave carrying a little less of it. Mama's house would not solve everything. Nothing solved everything, but it would be here, on this street, in this neighborhood, for the people who lived in it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything that had been intended. The morning moved the way mornings move when they are full of the right people, slowly, warmly, with conversations that started in one corner and migrated to another, with coffee that ran out and was made again, with the particular ease of a group of people who have been through something together and no longer need to perform anything for each other. At some point, without making a departure of it, Solomon stepped outside. The street was the same street it had always been. The barber shop, the laundromat, the sound of the neighborhood going about its Wednesday. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, with his hands in his coat pockets, and looked up at the sky, wide and pale blue above the rooftops. The kind of sky that makes a city look temporary, and the sky look permanent, which is of course accurate. He thought about his mother taking the bus to this neighborhood before it was light, for 11 years without complaint and without asking for anything to be different. He thought about his father, who had gone to work one morning and trusted that the place he worked was safe. Because that is what you do when you work somewhere, and trust is all you have. He thought about a photograph that had spent 33 years in his wallet and 4 months in a frame on a clinic wall in the neighborhood where both of those people had lived some portion of their lives. He took his keys from his pocket. The drive to the interstate took 6 minutes. He merged onto I-10, heading south, the same direction the black Mercedes had gone on the night. All of this had started 9 months ago, when he had left a gas station without looking back and without knowing what he was leaving behind. How was not running from anything this time. How was just driving. The way his mother used to say, people were meant to drive, with somewhere to go and enough road to think along the way. 6 months is long enough to change a habit. It isn't always long enough to change a man, but sometimes one night is enough to start, and 6 months is enough to finish the work. Solomon Ray Mercer pulled off the highway at 9:48 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. The air was dry and clear, the kind of Houston night that felt too quiet for a city this size. He didn't need fuel. The gauge read 3/4 full. He pulled into the station anyway, parked under the same washed-out fluorescent light he remembered, and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. I went inside. The overhead lights hummed the same low note. The same rotating hot dog rack stood near the register, still doing its slow, pointless rotation. But behind the counter sat someone new, a young woman, maybe 22, with a thick textbook propped open beside the register. Anatomy and Physiology, 2nd edition. She was highlighting a diagram of the human lymphatic system, with the yellow marker lips moving slightly as she read. She looked up. "Evening. Can I help you?" Solomon set a $100 bill on the counter. No gas. No coffee. No receipt needed. "What's this for?" she asked. "The book," he said. "Keep studying." She stared at the bill, then at him. He was already halfway to the door. Back in his car, he called Amara. She picked up on the third ring, her voice carrying the particular tiredness of someone who had been on their feet since morning and didn't mind. "Mr. Mercer, I'm at your old station," he said. "The coffee is still terrible." A pause. Then a short laugh, genuine, unguarded. "I told them to get a new machine for 2 years. Nobody listened." "How's the clinic?" "Busy." Celestine rearranged the waiting room again. Another pause. "She says the chairs were in the wrong order." "She's probably right." "She's always right," Amara said. "That's the thing about her." Solomon looked out through the windshield at the empty lot. "Good night, Miss Osei." "Good night, Mr. Mercer." He ended the call. Then he dialed Eli. His son answered before the second ring, the way he always did on Tuesday nights. Now, as if he'd been waiting without admitting it. "Hey, Dad." "Sunday dinner," Solomon said. "You in?" "Already planning to drive up Friday night." Solomon hadn't expected that. He didn't say anything for a moment. "I'll have the guest room ready." "Don't make it weird," Eli said. "Too late," Solomon replied. His son laughed, a full, easy laugh that reminded Solomon of a version of himself he hadn't thought about in decades. They talked for 11 minutes about nothing important. Eli's upcoming moot court, a barbecue restaurant near campus, a song Eli had heard that he thought Solomon would hate, but should try anyway. Solomon drove back toward the city while they spoke. He didn't rush the call. The penthouse was quiet when he arrived. The kitchen light was on, the one he'd started leaving on after Eli's first visit back. The dining table, which had held a single-place setting for 31 years, now had 4 seats arranged across one end. Not 10, not the full length of polished mahogany. Just 4, close together, the way people actually eat when they're not performing. Solomon reached into his coat pocket and took out a framed photograph. His mother, Elaine, in a pale blue dress, standing in front of a window in 1991. He had carried it folded in a leather wallet for 8 years after she passed. He had driven 40 miles in a police cruiser to get it back 6 months ago. He had kept it in a desk drawer since. Tonight he set it at the center of the table, not in a pocket, not in a drawer, here, where the light could reach it. He stepped back and looked at the frame for a long moment. Then the doorbell rang. Solomon straightened his jacket, walked to the door, and this time, for the first time in a very long time, He answered it without checking who was there first. If this story stayed with you, consider passing it along to someone who could use it today. More stories like this one are waiting. Come back whenever you're ready.